My son begged me to sign his loan. Days later, he blocked my number and left me stuck with the debt. I felt used and humiliated. Then his bank called me directly. "Sir, you need to see this before you do anything. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second because it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what it meant." A stranger at a credit union branch across town knew more about my own son's finances than I did, and she was the one who finally said the words that changed everything. "My name is Walter Ashby. Everyone calls me Walt. I'm 61 years old. I run a small cabinet shop off Route 9 in a town outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a business I built from nothing starting in 1994 in a rented bay with 2 table saws and a loan from my own father that took me 5 years to pay back. I believed for most of my life that if you worked hard and loved your family without conditions, that love came back to you the same way. I was wrong about that. Not about the working hard part, about the rest of it. This is the story of the worst July of my life, and the one afternoon inside it I will remember until the day I die. Standing in a credit union's back office, watching a woman slide a folder across a desk and say words that broke something open in me I didn't know was still closed. But none of this makes sense unless you understand where we started. I married my wife Denise in 1989, 36 years this past spring. We built a life on a quiet cul-de-sac just outside town, a 3-bedroom house with a detached garage I turned into a second workshop, a backyard that backs up to a stand of oak trees. Nothing fancy. Paid off in 2016. I remember standing on that porch the night I mailed the last mortgage payment, thinking I'd finally arrived somewhere. We raised 2 kids in that house. My daughter Paige is 28. She's a labor and delivery nurse at the regional hospital downtown, married to a good quiet man named Tom who does electrical contracting. Paige has never once in her adult life asked me for a dime. I want you to remember that because it matters later. My son Marcus, we call him Mark, is 31. Smart, charming in a way that used to make me proud and now, looking back, makes me nervous. Marcus bounced around for years, worked in restaurant kitchens since he was 19, worked his way up from dishwasher to line cook to sous chef at a decent steakhouse downtown. For a long time, I thought that was just Marcus finding his footing. Every father tells himself some version of that story. Then in early February of this year, Marcus called me on a Tuesday night and asked if he and Denise and I could sit down. "Family dinner," he said. "Nothing serious." I should have known right then. Nothing serious is never nothing serious. He showed up at the house with a laptop bag and a business partner I'd met exactly twice before, a man named Reese Calloway. Reese was maybe 36, an expensive watch, the kind of handshake that lasts half a second too long, always smiling like he already knew how the conversation was going to end. He and Marcus had worked together at the steakhouse for 2 years, and somewhere in there they decided they were going to open their own thing. A food truck to start, they said, something they could scale into a brick and mortar within a year or two. They were calling it Ember and Oak. Wood-fired everything, a build-out they'd sketched down to the equipment layout, the whole concept laid out on a slide deck Marcus had clearly spent weeks building. I'll be honest with you, I was moved. My son, sitting at my kitchen table at 31 years old, finally talking about something with fire in his voice instead of just getting by. Denise squeezed my hand under the table. She saw it too. The number they needed was $40,000. A personal loan through Meridian Credit Union, the branch on 4th Street. They had about $6,000 of that from savings between the two of them, but the credit union wanted a personal guarantor with strong credit before they'd release the rest. Marcus's credit wasn't there yet. Reese's, it turned out later, wasn't either, though nobody said that part out loud at my kitchen table. "Dad," Marcus said, and I remember exactly how he said it. Quiet, careful, like he'd rehearsed it in the car. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe in this with everything I have. I just need my name on the guarantee. That's it. You're not writing a check. You're just believing in me on paper." Denise was quiet on the drive to bed that night, and I knew that quiet. 36 years teaches you to read a silence like a weather report. "Walt," she finally said, sitting on the edge of the bed, unclipping her earrings. "I want to believe in him too. I do. But something about that Reese fella. I don't know. He looks at you like he's already spent your money in his head." I told her she was being protective. I told her Marcus had worked in restaurants his whole adult life and finally had a real shot. And what kind of father was I going to be if I let my own hesitation be the reason he never got it? I told myself that love without risk isn't really love at all. I signed the personal guarantee on a Thursday morning at a conference table on the 2nd floor of the Meridian branch downtown, across from a loan officer named Adriana Cole, professional woman, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of handshake that actually means something. She walked me through every page slowly, made sure I understood that as personal guarantor, if the business defaulted, the credit union could come after my personal assets to satisfy the debt. My house, my shop, everything. I nodded along like a man who fully understood what he was agreeing to. Truth is, I did not. I didn't know it yet, but the next time I sat in that building, it would not be to sign anything. It would be to hear a sentence that would end one version of my life and start another. The loan was structured to release in 3 draws tied to milestones, which Adriana explained was standard for a build-out loan like this. First draw for the truck purchase itself, second for kitchen equipment and installation, third for permits, wrap, and opening inventory. Each draw required documentation, invoices from licensed vendors, signed off by both Marcus and Reese as co-owners before Meridian would release funds. The first 6 weeks were good, genuinely good. Marcus texted me photos most days. The truck itself, a decommissioned box van they'd bought from a fleet auction outside Allentown. Then photos of the wrap going on, a deep charcoal gray with ember and oak lettered across the side in a font Marcus had gone back and forth on for a week. He called me most Sunday evenings, walked me through the budget, asked my opinion on equipment purchases because he knew I understood machinery and I understood money. For 6 weeks, I felt like the father I'd always wanted to be. Present, trusted, needed in the right way instead of the wrong way. "We're ahead of schedule, Dad," he told me on one of those calls, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. "Reese thinks we could be doing our first pop-up by the 4th of July. I believed him. I had no reason not to. The photos were real. The truck was real. The excitement in his voice was real, or at least it sounded real. And at the time, I didn't yet understand that a person can be genuinely excited about something and still be standing on ground that isn't as solid as they think it is. Denise asked about Reese maybe twice more in those 6 weeks. Always careful, never pushing too hard. "Have you met his family? Does he have people who'd vouch for him?" I didn't have good answers. I told her Marcus vouched for him, and that had to count for something, because Marcus had worked beside the man for 2 years and would know if something was off. I think about that now. How easily I let my son's trust stand in for my own judgment, because it was easier than doing the work of forming an opinion myself. Then sometime in mid-June, the calls slowed down. I noticed it the way you notice a clock that stopped ticking. Not all at once, but in the sudden quiet where a sound used to be. A Sunday went by with no call. I told myself he was busy. The pop-up prep must be eating every hour he had. Then another Sunday went by. I texted him. Short replies. "Busy week, Dad. Talk soon." The kind of message you send when you're managing someone, not talking to them. I didn't want to see it for what it was, plain and simple. There's a particular kind of denial that fathers are good at, where we take a pattern that would alarm us in anyone else's family and rename it as our son just being busy, our son finally having a real job with real responsibilities, our son growing up. On the second week of July, I got a piece of mail at my house I wasn't expecting. A notice from Meridian addressed to me as guarantor, informing me that the business account associated with the loan had missed a scheduled reconciliation check and that a review was underway. I didn't fully understand the language, but I understood the tone. Something was wrong. I called Marcus that night, straight to voicemail. I called again the next morning. Voicemail again. I told myself it was nothing. Phones die. People get slammed with work and forget to charge them, forget to check them, forget everything except the fire in front of them. I'd been that kind of tired myself, decades ago, running my shop those first hard years, and I remembered what it did to a person's attention. But there's a difference between a phone that's dead and a phone that goes straight to voicemail on the first ring, every single time, for 4 days running. I didn't want to know that difference yet. I called it bad luck. I called it a busy season. I called it anything except what my gut had already started telling me it was. Denise noticed before I said anything. She found me standing in the kitchen on a Thursday evening, phone in my hand, staring at a screen that hadn't changed in 20 minutes. "Still nothing?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "I'm sure it's fine." She didn't say "I told you so." I want that on the record because it would have been fair of her to say it, and she didn't. She just put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Call him again tomorrow." I did, straight to voicemail again. By the 4th day, I'd called him 9 times over that stretch, and every single one went to that same flat, automated voice telling me to leave a message after the tone. I left 3 messages. I don't remember exactly what I said in any of them. Something about checking in, something about hoping the truck launch was going well. I remember trying to sound casual, unbothered, like a father who wasn't lying awake at 11 at night, running through every version of what could be happening 3 hours away in a city where I no longer had eyes on my own son. Then on a Sunday, I called one more time, and instead of ringing through to voicemail like it always had, it went straight to a single tone and disconnected. That specific sound, the sound of a number that's been blocked. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, staring at the screen like it might change its answer if I looked at it long enough. 31 years, and my son had never once hung up on me, let alone blocked me. Not during his worst teenage years, not during the stretch after he dropped out of the culinary program he'd started and couldn't bring himself to tell us for 2 months, not ever. I called Denise into the kitchen and showed her the screen and watched her face do something I'd never seen it do before. Go from confused to frightened in about 4 seconds flat. "Walt," she said, "something's wrong. Something's really wrong." I didn't want to believe that yet. I wanted there to be some explanation that didn't involve my son actively choosing to shut me out. A new phone, a number he'd switched by accident, some setting he didn't understand. I ran through every version of an innocent explanation I could construct, and none of them held up against the fact that a blocked number doesn't happen by accident. Somebody has to sit there and make that choice. That's when I called my oldest friend, Frank Delvecchio. Frank and I have known each other since 1996, back when he ran a small auto body shop 2 units down from mine on Route 9. Frank's the kind of man who tells you the truth even when you'd rather he didn't, which is exactly why I called him instead of just sitting with it alone. "Walt, listen to me," he said, after I laid the whole thing out over coffee at the diner we've been going to for close to 20 years. When a grown man blocks his father's number 4 months after that father co-signs a loan for him, that is not a coincidence, and you know it isn't. I don't want to believe that, Frank. I know you don't. Frank stirred his coffee slow, the way he does when he's about to say something he knows I don't want to hear. "But you didn't drive out to where that truck's supposed to be yet, did you?" "I hadn't. So go look," Frank said. "Today, before you build a whole story in your head out of nothing but a bad feeling. Go see the truck with your own eyes. I sat there with my coffee going cold in front of me and thought about all the reasons I'd been avoiding exactly that. Part of it was fear, plain and simple. As long as I didn't go look, I could keep telling myself a version of events where everything was fine and Marcus was just overwhelmed. The second I drove out there, whatever I found would be real, and I wouldn't be able to talk myself out of it anymore. What if it's fine? I said. What if I drive all the way out there and it's exactly what he said it was, and I've just made myself look like I don't trust my own son? Frank looked at me for a long moment. Then you drive home relieved, and you never tell him you went. But Walt, in 30 years, I don't think I've seen you this rattled over a phone call. Your gut's already told you something. You're just waiting for permission to listen to it. He was right, and I knew it sitting there. I'd built my whole working life around trusting instruments, trusting measurements, trusting the numbers a machine gave me over whatever story I wanted to tell myself about a piece of material. I'd never once ignored a bad reading on a gauge because I liked the part better the way I'd imagined it. But here I was, doing exactly that with my own son, because the alternative was too frightening to sit with. I'll go tomorrow, I said. Go today, Frank said. Whatever's happening isn't getting better while you wait. I drove out the next morning anyway, not because I was brave about it, because I barely slept that night, turning it over and over, and by 6 in the morning, I couldn't stand not knowing any longer than I already had. I told Denise where I was going before I left. She didn't try to stop me. She just said, "Call me the second you know something," and kissed my cheek at the door, like I was heading into something bigger than a drive across town. I think some part of her already knew it was. I want you to picture what I expected to see. The truck parked on the permitted lot off Delancey Street, where Marcus told me they'd been running weekend pop-ups since late June. Maybe a small line of people, string lights, a folding sign, the smell of something wood-fired drifting across the gravel. What I actually found was an empty lot. Gravel, weeds, pushing up through cracks near the fence line, a chain-link gate with a padlock on it that looked like it hadn't been opened in weeks. No truck, no wrap, no charcoal gray with ember and oak lettered across the side. No sign of a single living soul. I got out of my own truck and walked the perimeter of that lot for longer than I probably needed to, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. I checked the address twice against the pin Marcus had sent me weeks earlier when he'd first told us about the location. It was the right lot. There was no mistaking it. I stood there and tried to construct some explanation that made sense. Maybe they'd moved locations and he'd forgotten to tell me. Maybe the truck was in for repairs somewhere, and this was just a temporary gap. I ran through every version I could think of, and every single one of them fell apart under the simple fact that a padlocked gate with weeds growing through the gravel doesn't happen in the space of a busy week. That gate had been locked for a long time. I called the number for the property management company, listed on a faded sign near the entrance. A woman answered on the third ring, sounded surprised anyone was calling about that lot at all. "That lease got terminated back in May," she said. "Non-payment. We had to change the locks ourselves in June, May." My son had been texting me photos of that build-out in early June like it was still happening. Either those photos were older than he'd let on, or they weren't what they appeared to be at all, and standing there on that gravel with my phone pressed to my ear, I didn't yet know which possibility frightened me more. I sat in my truck in that empty lot for a long time before I could make myself drive home. I didn't call Denise right away like I'd promised. I needed a few minutes first, just to sit with what I now knew and couldn't unknow. My son had not been running a food truck out of that location in June. Whatever those photos were, whatever those Sunday phone calls had been, some part of the story I'd been told was not true. I didn't know it yet, sitting there. But the answers I was looking for were not going to come from my son. They were going to come from the one place I never expected. A phone call from a stranger who worked for the same credit union I'd signed my name to 5 months earlier. The call came 3 days later on a Thursday morning at 11:40. I was at my shop, standing over a table saw running a batch of cabinet fronts for a client outside Lancaster, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. "Mr. Ashby," the voice said. "My name is Adriana Cole. I'm a senior loan officer with Meridian Credit Union. We spoke back in February when you signed as personal guarantor on the Ember and Oak loan. I remember you," I said, and my whole body went still in a way the machinery around me couldn't touch. "Mr. Ashby," she said, and there was something careful in her voice, the tone of someone who's had this exact conversation before and knows exactly how much weight it carries. "I need you to come into the branch this afternoon if you're able. There are some things related to this loan that, as guarantor, you need to see in person before you make any decisions on your own." I asked her right there, standing next to a running saw with sawdust settling on the floor, whether my son was in some kind of trouble. She paused long enough that I heard it. "I'd rather walk you through the documentation in person. I don't want to alarm you over the phone with half the picture." I was in my truck 11 minutes later, saw still running behind me, a batch of cabinet fronts half finished on the table. I didn't care. I called my shop foreman from the parking lot and told him to shut everything down and lock up when he was ready, and I drove downtown with my hands too tight on the wheel and my mind running through every version of what that folder could contain. I sat in that same second-floor conference room where I'd signed my name in February, except this time, Adriana Cole wasn't alone. There was a man from the credit union's fraud and risk department sitting beside her, younger, quieter, a folder in front of him thick enough that I felt my stomach drop just looking at it. Mr. Ashby, Adriana said, sliding the folder toward me. I'm going to walk you through this slowly, and I want you to ask me to stop at any point if you need to. Here is what that folder told me, laid out in bank statements, draw request forms, and vendor invoices that I read 3 times each because I genuinely did not want them to be true. 2 of the 3 scheduled draws had already gone out against that milestone structure Adriana had walked me through back in February. Roughly $26,000 released against vendor paperwork both partners were required to sign. But the lot on Delancey Street, the one I'd stood in 3 days earlier with weeds pushing up through the gravel, had maybe $6,000 of actual work reflected anywhere. I know construction and fabrication costs. I've spent 30 years around material pricing and labor estimates. $6,000 of visible progress does not account for 26. The invoices, the fraud officer explained, had come from 2 vendors for the second draw. One was a legitimate fleet parts supplier who had in fact sold them the box van and been paid fairly. The other, a company called Callaway Equipment Leasing, did not check out. Callaway Equipment Leasing, the fraud officer said, turning to a specific page, is registered to a residential address about 40 minutes from here. Its listed managing member is Reese Callaway. I sat there for a moment, not fully able to process what I was looking at. My son's business partner had apparently created a shell company using his own name, submitted it as a legitimate equipment vendor, and had the credit union release loan funds directly to an account he controlled. Where's my son in this? I asked, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I wanted. The fraud officer, whose name I later learned was Marcus Ferreira, which struck me as a strange, small coincidence given my own son's name, turned to another page. Mr. Ashby, your son's signature is on both completed draw requests. As co-owner, that was required for release. I'm not in a position to tell you what he knew or didn't know at the time he signed them. That's not something our records can answer. What I can tell you is that the pattern of these transfers, moving into an account associated with Mr. Callaway within 48 hours of each release, is consistent with what our fraud team classifies as structured diversion. We flagged it internally about 10 days ago and froze the remaining undispersed balance immediately. That's the only reason there's still $14,000 sitting untouched instead of gone entirely. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting in that chair because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not feel rage first. I felt something closer to grief. The specific physical kind, the kind that sits low in your chest like a stone you swallowed whole. Because in that folder, I wasn't just looking at fraud. I was looking at 2 pages with my son's own handwriting on them, and I did not yet know if that handwriting belonged to a victim or a participant. Mr. Ashby, Adriana said gently, closing the folder halfway. I called you in today because as guarantor, you're going to receive formal notice of default proceedings within the next 10 business days. If this isn't resolved, I wanted you to understand the full picture before that letter arrives and before you make any decisions, financial or otherwise, based on incomplete information. I've seen guarantors panic and do things that hurt them worse. I didn't want that for you. I asked her why the credit union would go out of their way to do that for me. She looked at me for a moment and something in her face softened just slightly. Because you sat in that chair in February and asked me 3 separate times what happens to my house if this goes wrong. Some people don't ask that question at all. I remembered you. I sat there a moment longer, staring at that folder, at my son's signature staring back up at me from 2 separate pages. I thought about every version of this conversation I could have had with him directly. If only he'd picked up the phone instead of blocking me. I thought about how strange it was that the truth of what had happened to my family's money had reached me first through a stranger's careful, professional kindness rather than through my own son's voice. What happens now? I asked. Now, you go talk to a lawyer before you talk to anyone else, Adriana said, and you find out where your son actually is. I drove home that afternoon with that sentence sitting in my chest like a stone. I drove home and didn't say a word to Denise for almost 20 minutes. Just sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded, staring at nothing while she stood at the stove, not cooking anything, just waiting. 36 years teaches a woman to know when silence needs room to breathe before it can turn into words. Walt, she finally said, talk to me. I told her everything. Every page, every number, every name. I watched her face go through the same journey mine had. Disbelief, then grief, then something harder settling underneath it. That Reese, she said quietly. I told you the night before you signed. You did, I said. I'm not going to pretend you didn't. But here's what I didn't know yet, sitting at that kitchen table that evening. I didn't know where Marcus actually was. I didn't know whether my son was hiding from me because he'd helped steal from his own father, or hiding from me because he was drowning in something he hadn't caused and didn't know how to face. And I was about to find out that the answer was far more complicated and far sadder than either version I'd built in my head. You need a lawyer before you need a conversation with him, Denise said. Frank's right about that much, even if you didn't want to hear it. She was right too. Everyone around me seemed to be seeing this more clearly than I was, and I was starting to understand that grief does something to a person's ability to think straight, even grief you haven't fully named yet. So the next morning, I called an attorney a client of mine had used for a business dispute a couple of years back, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Ford with an office downtown. I sat across from her desk desk and told her everything Adriana had shown me. Renata listened, took notes in small, precise handwriting, and then said something that reframed the entire situation for me. "Walt," she said, setting her pen down, "as guarantor, you have a right to request the full loan file directly from the credit union, independent of whatever your son tells you. And before you decide anything else, I'd track down where he's actually been hiding, because there's a real difference under the law, and honestly under any decent understanding of fairness, between a business partner who helped divert funds and one who got used by someone he trusted and is now too ashamed to answer his own father's calls." I hadn't considered that second possibility with any real weight until she said it out loud. I'd been so certain driving home from the credit union the day before that my son had chosen this, that he'd looked at his own father's signature on a guarantee and decided it was worth spending to fund someone else's greed. I'd built that story in 24 hours flat, and I'd built it out of hurt, not evidence. "You don't know that yet," Renata said, watching my face, "and I'd caution you hard against deciding you do before you've actually heard from him." "He blocked my number," I said. "He hasn't given me the chance to hear anything." "That tells you he's hiding something," she said. "It doesn't tell you what. Fear and guilt can look identical from the outside. I've represented men who did terrible things and slept fine, and I've represented men who did nothing wrong at all and couldn't look their own families in the eye out of pure shame. You won't know which one your son is until you're standing in front of him." I sat with that the rest of the afternoon. Renata requested the full loan file that afternoon, and it arrived by secure email late that night. I stayed up until nearly 1 in the morning, reading through every page at my kitchen table with a legal pad beside me, cross-referencing dates the way I would cross-reference a machining tolerance sheet, because that is simply how my brain works when I am trying not to fall apart. And there, buried in an email chain the credit union had pulled as part of their fraud review, dated the 3rd week of June, was something that changed the entire shape of this story. An email from Marcus to Reese, time-stamped 11:47 at night. "Reese, I checked the equipment leasing invoice against what's actually on the truck and the numbers don't match up. Where is the rest of that money going? I need an answer tonight or I'm calling Adriana at the credit union myself tomorrow morning." Reese's reply, sent 4 minutes later. "Mark, calm down. It's a timing issue with supplier deposits. I'll walk you through it in person. Don't call the bank, you'll tank the draw schedule and kill the whole thing over a paperwork lag. Trust me." I sat there at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning with that email glowing on my laptop screen, and something in my chest that had been clenched for 2 days finally, slightly, let go. My son had seen it. My son had asked the exact question I would have asked. And then somehow, between that night and the day he blocked my number, something had gone very wrong, and I still didn't know if it was fear or shame or something worse that had kept him silent since. I read that exchange probably a dozen times before I finally closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't sleep much. I kept turning that email over, trying to reconcile the son who'd written it, sharp enough to catch the discrepancy himself, brave enough to threaten calling the bank directly, with the son who'd then gone dark on his own father for weeks afterward. Those two versions of Marcus didn't fit together cleanly in my head yet. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find my son in a place I never in 1,000 years would have guessed to look, and what I saw there would tell me more about who he really was than any credit union folder ever could. Frank helped me track him down 2 days later, not through any detective work, through his own son, who still worked kitchen shifts with a few of the same cooks Marcus had come up through the ranks with. One of them mentioned casually over a beer that Marcus had picked up night shifts at a place called the Route 9 Grill, a diner, not a restaurant, working the overnight fry station for cash, using a name on the schedule that wasn't quite his own. I drove out there myself at 11 at night and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I went in, because I honestly did not know what version of my son I was about to find. Part of me was still braced for the possibility that Renata had been too generous, that the email I'd found was one honest moment inside a much larger, much colder betrayal, and that whatever I saw through that diner window would confirm the worst version instead of the better one. I made myself go in anyway. I owed him that much, and I owed myself the truth, whichever direction it turned out to run. The diner was mostly empty at that hour, just a couple of truckers at the counter and a waitress refilling ketchup bottles near the register. I walked in slow, scanning the pass window into the kitchen, and there he was, standing at a flat-top griddle under fluorescent lights, apron-stained, hair flat with sweat, easily 30 pounds lighter than the confident man who'd sat at my kitchen table in February, with a slide deck full of dreams. He looked up, saw me through the pass window, and I watched every ounce of color drain out of his face in real time, the spatula frozen halfway between the grill and a plate. The cook next to him said something I didn't catch. Marcus didn't answer him. He just stood there staring at me like a man who'd been expecting this moment for weeks, and still wasn't ready for it now that it had arrived. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just held his eyes through that glass and tipped my head toward the door. A small motion, the same one I used to make from the bleachers when he was a kid and it was time to go. He knew exactly what it meant. He always had. He said something to the other cook, untied his apron with hands that weren't quite steady, and walked toward the back exit without looking at me again. I went around the building to meet him by the dumpsters, because I understood without either of us saying it that whatever was about to happen shouldn't happen in front of customers, in front of co-workers, in front of anyone who didn't already know what these last 5 months had cost both of us. us. He was waiting there when I came around the corner, arms wrapped around himself despite the warm night, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I could hear the highway a few hundred yards off, the low hum of it filling the silence. Neither one of us seemed able to break first. I'd rehearsed a dozen versions of this conversation on the drive over, and every single one of them evaporated the second I actually saw his face. "Dad," he said, voice already breaking on the first word. "How did you—" "Frank's son. Doesn't matter." I stood there a moment, hands in my pockets, looking at my son under the security light behind that diner, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel standing there. Not the rage I'd been carrying around for 2 days like a stone in my chest. Something closer to the fear I used to feel watching him learn to ride a bike. That particular helpless love you have for someone you can't protect from themselves, no matter how badly you want to. "I found out what Reese was doing in June," he said, and once he started, the words came out fast, like he'd been holding them back so long they'd built up pressure behind a door that had finally given way. I checked the equipment invoice against what was actually on the truck. The numbers didn't add up. I confronted him about it that same night. "I read the email," I said quietly. "I saw what you wrote him." He looked up at that, something flickering across his face. Surprise, maybe relief, maybe just exhaustion at not having to explain the beginning of it from scratch. "Then you know I tried to do the right thing. I told him I was calling the bank the next morning if he didn't explain it. So what happened? Why didn't you call?" Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a second I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then it came out of him in pieces, like something being pulled out by the root. He came to my apartment the next day. Not defensive, not scared, calm, like he'd already planned exactly what he was going to say. He told me if I called the bank, he'd tell them I'd known about the equipment leasing company from the start, that I'd helped set it up. He showed me an old text thread, stuff I'd said months earlier about needing to move fast on equipment, needing whatever advantage we could get, and he told me it would read exactly like I'd been in on it from day one. My signature was on both draw requests either way. He said it would come down to my word against his, except his word would come with a paper trail that made me look complicit, and mine would just be me saying I didn't know. He said nobody believes that, not from a business partner, not with my name right there on the paperwork. "So you panicked," I said. "I panicked," he said, and his voice cracked fully now, no longer holding anything back. "I thought if I could just find a way to quietly cover what he'd taken before anyone noticed, I could fix it without anyone ever having to know how stupid I'd been. I picked up shifts here under a different name because I was scared if Reese somehow found out I was still trying to make this right on my own, without doing what he told me to do, he'd move faster to bury me first. I was trying to save up enough to put back what was missing before the credit union ever caught the pattern. And blocking me?" He finally looked me full in the face, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was small enough to be genuinely afraid of disappointing me in a way that mattered more than anything else in the world. "I couldn't stand hearing your voice and lying to you every single time you called," he said. "And I couldn't stand telling you the truth either, because I didn't know how to say I might have let a con man use my own signature to steal from my own father, and I might not be able to fix it before it destroyed everything. I didn't know how to do either one, so I did neither. I just disappeared. I know how that looks. I know it probably looks exactly like I planned it with him from the start. I don't have any way to prove to you that I didn't, except that email, and the fact that I'm standing here instead of somewhere he can't find me." I stood there in that parking lot for a long moment, looking at my exhausted, ashamed 31-year-old son, cooking hash browns under an assumed name at midnight, trying to quietly undo a disaster he hadn't caused, and I felt something shift permanently in how I understood this entire story. He was not innocent. That much I won't pretend away. He'd been naive. He'd been slow to act, and slower still to trust the people who actually loved him enough to help him fix it instead of hide from it. 2 of his own signatures sat in that credit union file, whether his intentions were good or not, but he had not conspired to steal from his own father. He had been manipulated by a man he trusted, cornered by exactly the kind of threat designed to make an honest mistake look like a calculated crime, and too ashamed and too frightened to make the one phone call that would have actually helped him from the very beginning. Here's the part that mattered most, and I won't soften it. I didn't hug him in that parking lot. What I did was put my hand on his shoulder the way I used to when he was small, and I said, "Get in the truck. We're going to fix this the right way starting tonight, but you're going to tell me everything, every single piece of it on the way." The next 10 days moved fast, with a clarity I hadn't felt since I first opened my shop back in 1994. Renata helped Marcus prepare a full statement for the credit union's fraud division, laying out the June email exchange and everything after. The fraud team confirmed what we already suspected. Reese had run this exact play before, under a different company name, against a different unlucky partner who'd never had the resources to fight back. Charges were filed against Reese Calloway for wire fraud and forgery related to the diverted draws. Because the credit union had frozen the remaining $14,000 before it could be touched, and because Marcus's cooperation gave prosecutors a clean paper trail, restitution proceedings opened to recover as much of the missing $20,000 as possible from Reese's personal assets, which it turned out included a motorcycle he'd bought in June with money that should have gone into kitchen equipment. The credit union restructured the loan. I worked with Renata and Adriana to negotiate the personal guarantee down to just the legitimately used funds, roughly $9,000 once the Fleet Parts invoice was verified. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't the $40,000 nightmare I'd been staring down alone 2 weeks earlier either. Marcus sold his car and took the bus for 4 months while he worked 2 jobs, the diner overnights and a line cook shift at a different restaurant during the day, and paid down his half of that remaining balance dollar by dollar, month by month, the way I once paid back my own father for that first pair of table saws. I didn't pay it off for him, and that distinction matters. I helped him understand it. I sat with him at that kitchen table more than once going over the numbers, but I did not simply hand him a way out. Some debts, even the ones that aren't entirely your fault, are worth paying with your own 2 hands, because that's the only way the lesson actually holds. But there's one more part of this story I need to tell you, because a story about betrayal isn't complete without the person who never once wavered. Somewhere in the middle of all this, sorting through old text messages while trying to reconstruct a timeline for Renata, I found something I'd completely missed back in February. A message from Paige, sent the night after that family dinner where Marcus and Reese first pitched the food truck. I'd read it at the time, half distracted, and never really let it land. Dad, I don't want to be the negative one, but something about Reese makes my skin crawl. I've met guys like that at the hospital, family members of patients, the kind who talk a big game and disappear the second something goes wrong. Please just be careful before you put your name on anything. Love you. I'd sent back a quick, thanks sweetheart, I'll be careful, and moved on with my night, never once following up, never once asking her what exactly she'd seen in him that worried her so much. I called Paige on a Sunday evening in late August and asked her to come over for dinner. Just the 2 of us and Denise. No agenda mentioned. When she got there, I sat her down at that same kitchen table and told her the whole story, start to finish. And then I told her I owed her an apology I should have given her back in February. You saw this coming before any of us, I told her. And I brushed it off because I wanted so badly to believe in your brother's dream that I didn't want to hear anything that got in the way of it. That wasn't fair to you. Paige has never asked me for money in her entire adult life. Not for her wedding, not for a car, not when she and Tom were saving for their first house on simple dinners 4 nights a week. She has a dream of her own, mentioned quietly maybe 3 times in 5 years and never pushed. A small maternal health clinic for patients without reliable insurance, the kind of need she sees every overnight shift on that ward. In September, Denise and I sat down and restructured our own estate planning with Renata's help. Not out of guilt, and not to buy anyone's loyalty, because loyalty like Paige's was never for sale in the first place. We set up a dedicated trust, funded initially from our savings, earmarked specifically to help launch that clinic when she's ready, with the rest of our estate divided fairly between both our children once we're gone, structured this time with the kind of protections I wish I'd understood back in February. When I told her about the trust sitting at that same kitchen table, Paige cried harder than I'd seen her cry since her own wedding day, and she told me through tears that she never once did any of it expecting anything back. I know, I told her. That's exactly why you're getting it. It's been 4 months now since that night behind the diner on Route 9. Ember and Oak never launched. Not under that name, not with that truck. Marcus walked away from the whole thing rather than try to salvage something built on a foundation like that. He's back working as a sous chef downtown, saving slowly, quietly, talking now about maybe trying again someday. Smaller, simpler, with real partners. He's actually vetted himself this time. I think about that day standing outside the 4th Street branch a lot. The way I felt walking in, not knowing whether I was about to learn my son had betrayed me or been failed by someone he trusted. I think about how close I came to letting a few days of fear write the whole rest of the story before I had a single fact to stand on. Love without questions isn't really love. It's just hope wearing love's clothes. My son is still my son. He made a serious mistake born out of fear more than greed, and he is still every single week paying the real cost of that mistake with his own 2 hands, which is exactly where it belongs.